probably painfully obvious I have a cold, so I will apologize if I'm a little snuffly. I wrote this before I had the cold, so hopefully it's fairly coherent. Please feel free to interrupt if you have questions along the way. It's a sort of odd talk for me to give because it is in part based on work that I've done with my collaborator James Pine, who's now at Stanford University. But it's in part a sampling of other work, and really more in the spirit of stuff I thought you might ought to know about student debt in America. May generate some conversation, some of it may be surprising, some of it may be unsurprising. We'll see. So the title of the talk is There a Student Debt Crisis, Some Misperceptions, and Some Causes for Concern. So if you're concerned, you're certainly not alone. This is a Google trend for the term student debt crisis since 2004. You can see you are here. You're in the room, you're all trending, you're all right there. A lot of people are talking about this, a lot of people are concerned about it. This hits the news a lot. Here's just sort of a smattering of recent headlines, both national, this is all Harvard Business Review, Fox News and CNN on the same page, so you don't see that all the time. And the Wall Street Journal, Long Road to the Student Debt Crisis. Our own governor, as you probably know, is clued into this and is appointing a task force to look at student debt, to understand what we can do about student debt. So this is a topic of great interest to lots of people. It's a topic that's getting a lot of airplay. And it's a topic that I think sometimes lacks the sort of rigorous empirical foundation it ought to have. I'm not going to tell you everything's way off base, so spoiler alert, there's some cause for concern. But some of the things I tell you might surprise you. So the first thing I want to talk about is understanding the composition of this $1.6 trillion in debt. That's a number that gets thrown around a lot. When we started this work, I think it was 1.2 trillion that was in the news quite a bit. Now we're at 1.6. And I want to distinguish between undergraduate debt and debt held by graduate and professional students. And that doesn't mean it's only graduate and professional debt. I don't have a good way of taking apart the debt that students got into as undergrads and graduates, but I do have a good way of discerning who has an advanced degree and who has a baccalaureate or lower credential. I'm going to talk to you about trends in undergraduate debt, and here I want you to think more about the entire distribution of debt. So we hear a lot about the average level of debt, and that's an important number to bear in mind. But I'm going to talk to you about how that distribution has become more skewed over time. And there are more high borrowers that may be disproportionately contributing to the drift of that average upward. So I want to talk to you a bit about that, and then about the role of for-profit schools, and about student choice more generally in the types of institutions they attend. And then the distribution of debt by family resources, by race, ethnicity, and by gender, and how that's changed or stayed the same. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I learned about default. I was telling Cliff, this isn't something I know a lot about, so I did some research before this talk, because I was sort of curious, and I used this talk to motivate me to learn some stuff. And it's kind of interesting. And then finally, I want to talk to you about graduate student debt, and this is where I think there's perhaps more cause for concern. So I'll talk to you about debt across different types of degrees, different types of people, and I'll try to hit this question a little bit, although I won't give you a terribly satisfactory answer. But of course, at the end of the day, this is an investment, and so if you think about the money people shell out, you might think, well, if it's a lot, that'd be okay if there's a big return on it, or if you're fairly confident in the return, right? Where you get worried is if the returns are uncertain or the returns are less than what you put in. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is a shamelessly lifted slide from Sue Dynarski. Sue Dynarski, if you don't know, is one of the authorities on student finance in general. She's an economist. I give her a ton of credit. She's at Michigan. And she spent a sabbatical year living in Washington, D.C., trying to get better data for us and writing columns for the New York Times and the Washington Post about student debt. So she's been all over this. And what you can see here is in red, you have the trend in student loan debt. And then in blue, you'll see credit card, green auto loan, and then the darker blue is HELOCs. And what you can see is from the start of this series, which would have been the fourth quarter of 2004 up through the end, which is the fourth quarter of 2014, student debt really takes over. So you're right, there's a lot more student debt floating around out there, right? This is the student loan balance. On our balance sheets, how much student debt is there? right? HELOC, what is HELOC? It's a loan, right? Home equity loan, line of credit, home equity line of credit. So student debt has become a much bigger deal. And you might wonder who holds all the student debt. So here I'm showing you data that we took from the Survey of Consumer Finances. The Survey of Consumer Finances is something the Federal Reserve does, and they take every couple years a look at the assets that people hold, the debts they hold, and try to make sense of where we are financially. So what you see here, first I want to call your attention to the very different magnitudes of these bars. So I've put them on a chart for a reason I'll talk about in a moment. So they're comparable, but in fact, on the left, you have the Survey of Consumer Finance debt load for student debt. In 1992, that totaled $41.5 billion. And on the right side, in 2016, it totaled $1.3 trillion. That is a huge change in student debt. So I don't present these bars to mislead you into thinking there's been no change in debt. There's been a tremendous change in the aggregate level of debt. The reason I wanted to show you these figures, and this is from a paper that James and I published recently, and probably the reason that I was asked to give this talk, is to look at the composition of that debt. What you see on the top there is doctorates, and those include professional degrees. So JDs and MDs are in there along with PhDs. And then just under that, you have master's degrees. And so the entire debt portfolio that was accounted for by master's and doctoral degrees in 1992 was about 45%. In 2016, it's about 51%. So when you hear 1.3 or $1.6 trillion, I don't want you to think this is the amount of money held by students who finished their bachelor's degree. That's not true. A little more than half of that debt is held by people with graduate and professional degrees. And that's something that doesn't seem to come up in the news very often. Doesn't mean it's okay, we'll get to that. But the first point I want to emphasize is that this is by and large not debt exclusively held by undergraduates. And again, the undergraduate debt these folks carry is rolled in for those with graduate degrees. So it's not that it's absent. But if you think about the earnings power of somebody with a JD or MD, certainly, but also perhaps with a master's or with a PhD, it is different from the earnings power of a baccalaureate graduate. And I think that's important to bear in mind. Okay, so point one, there's been an expansion in the share of educational debt that is held by those with a graduate or professional degree over time. Now, another thing we did is look at data on debt for those who entered college in 1996 and 2004. And here I'm working off of a paper that is a working paper, the WCER. It's a WCER working paper, you can get it off the web. Sad story about this paper, cautionary tale for you doctoral students out there. We thought this was like a really great idea, and apparently somebody else did too. And so it's not published because they published theirs first. But I still think it's a good idea. What we're looking at here is looking at first-time dependent students who attended a baccalaureate college within 5 years of enrollment. And by that, I mean, first of all, first-time dependent, right? So they're still claimed by somebody else as a dependent. This does not include independent students. And the reason for that is that we wanted to understand something about how social background influences the opportunities students have, and we simply don't have that social background information for independent students. And then the second piece is who attended a baccalaureate within 5 years of enrollment, because we include people who start at associate's programs as well. So if they ever attended a baccalaureate college within those 5 years, they're included. If they exclusively attend a junior college, community college, or a certificate program, they're not included. So bear that in mind. This population I'm talking about turns out to include about 7 of 10 first-year students, and they hold about 90% of the debt that we observe in these data. So it's most of them, but it's not all. And this is going to cover debt through the 5th year after initial enrollment, which means some of them will enroll for a 6th year, some of them will go on to graduate or professional school. So this is not going to be their total educational debt ever. It'll be a pretty good gauge of the debt they incurred during their undergraduate program, but not quite perfect. Now, I will also tell you that there are more recent data available. They were not available to me. And as much as I like you all, I didn't acquire those data to crunch through them and update these numbers for you. It would be awesome if some enterprising soul wanted to do so, because I would love to see what these trends look like now. But for now, we'll go through the 96 and 2004 cohorts, which means they will have this will cover debt that students had in 2001 and 2009. Okay. So first, a relatively simple bar chart showing you, and the x-axis is bins of debt. So the bottom is 0, students who had no debt at all. And the next one is 1 to 4,999, the next 5,000 to 9,999, etc. So that's the x-axis. The y-axis is the percent of dependent students in each of those bins. The left bar, the blue bar, is 2001. The right bar, which is in red, is 2009. And what you can see is that there have been some shifts, but not a sea change in the distribution of this debt. For example, you'll see that where 38% of students had no undergraduate debt in that 1996 cohort, we were down to 34%, so 4 percentage points fewer in the later cohort. At the same time, you'll see up at the top of the distribution, we're getting a little more spike in the over $45,000 bin, from 2.2% to 5.8%, right? So that's a change. It's a change that may have more of an effect on the mean than it does on the overall distribution of debt, but it's certainly a change worth paying attention to. That's sort of the shape of educational debt across these two cohorts. So in general, I'd say there are some shifts, but not a ton. Fewer students with no debt, more students with really high levels of debt, but then there's some jiggling around in the middle. So I'm going to show you this graph for graduate and professional students as well. For now, I'm going to show it to you for undergrads. I tell you that because it's a noisy picture and it's worth sort of following along and trying to stay with me. Okay. So on the x-axis this time, we have the decile of debt conditional on having any debt. That is, if you had $0 in debt, you're not in this picture. This is a picture of the debt level among those who assume any debt. And we break it into 10 equal-sized groups, 10 deciles. Okay? From the lowest levels of debt over here to the highest levels of debt over on the right side. The left axis tells you the average total borrowed for each decile. And that's plotted in the dashed lines. So for example, if you look at the median student here, in both periods, the median student owed about $20,000 5 years after initial enrollment in a 5 years after their initial enrollment. Okay? So that's how you can read that. And then the red line, which corresponds to this number over here, this is the ratio of the average in each of those deciles for the latter period, 2004, to the earlier period, 1996. For example, we can say that the second decile, people in the bottom 20% of debt, the ratio there is between 1.1 and 1.2, meaning their debt levels increased 10 to 20% over that period of time. Now in absolute dollars, because it's a small dollar amount, it's not a big number. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, the average level of debt in real dollars in the bottom decile in 96 was $265. And in 2009, it was $299. So that's not a huge shift, but that's what those ratio numbers tell you. I think the big story here is twofold. One, how closely those dashed lines track up into around the 8th to 9th decile. That is, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of change in those debt levels over time. Two, you can see the ratio, the red line. I would think of that as sort of averaging around 5% to 7% change over time. The 7th and 8th deciles are just about flat, and then you've got a little more lumpiness in the 4th to 6th deciles. But what you can see is, in general, debt didn't change tremendously over this period for the bottom 80% of borrowers. Changed a little, it went up a little bit. Those are not big changes. On the other hand, the changes at the top are pretty substantial. So among top-end borrowers, people who borrowed the most 10% or the highest 20%, of amounts borrowed. Those ratios are more on the order of 15 to 30%. That's a big change. That's a big change in how much students are borrowing. So the change in the debt burden over this period of time is dominated by those in the top 20% of the distribution. If there's a crisis in undergraduate debt during this period, I would argue that crisis is found in the top 20%, not the bottom 80% of borrowers. So we looked at this a little more closely, and now we're really thinking about what are some attributes that predict being in relatively high levels of debt. So for those of you who know something about statistics, this is a linear probability model. For those of you who don't, this is the difference in the percentage chance of being in the top 20% of the debt distribution. For example, if we look at the difference between in-state public non-flagships, think like a UW-La Crosse, and the in-state public flagship, think of us, there is a 6 percentage point difference in the chances that a student who attends Madison would be in the top 20% of debt relative to a student who attends La Crosse in 1996, a change that is not statistically significant, meaning we're not really confident it's there. Could be there, could be 6%, could be as high as 12%, could be as low as like minus 3%, okay? What you see there is 1996 and 2004, and what I call your attention to is the private nonprofits, and in particular, the moderately competitive private nonprofit, where the chance that you're in this top 20% of debt was 9 percentage points higher if you attended a moderately competitive private nonprofit than if you attended your in-state institution in 1996. That goes to 17 percentage points in 2004. So your risk of being in that highest 20% increases over time if you're in a moderately competitive private nonprofit institution. Think of like a Carleton or a McAllister kind of place. The most competitive private nonprofits, think about your more elite sort of Harvard, Yale types. The risk of being in that top 20% hasn't changed a lot and was always higher than public non-flagship institutions, which probably makes sense to you. The other one people talk a lot about is for-profit institutions. For-profit institutions are an important part of this puzzle. They may not be as important as you think they are. So important in the sense that where they didn't have much of a contribution to that top 20% of debt in 96, in 2004, if you attend a for-profit institution, you are 15 percentage points more likely than if you attended your non-flagship in-state institution to be in that top 20% of debt in 2004. Who knows what percentage of students are enrolled in for-profits? Ballpark, anyone?
A million.
Percentage?
Wow. Out of 15.
Yeah, so it's about 7 to 9%. Yeah. Now it'll be more for non-traditional students, right? So for-profits have gotten really good, for example, at getting GI Bill money. So there are places where they might have more market dominance. But in terms of these first-time dependent students going on to post-secondary institutions, it's about 7% to 9%. Doesn't mean we shouldn't care about students that go there, to be clear. But if you think about the big debt puzzle, the 1.6 trillion, and then the half that is associated with those who do not get an advanced degree, at most you got 9% of students left over who are attending for-profits, and they are at higher risk of being in substantial debt, but it's not a big piece of the debt portfolio. So there's been recent work on racial and ethnic disparities in debt, so I'll touch on that here, and I'll come back to it when we talk about graduate and professional debt. Where there was a higher likelihood of African Americans being in that top 20% than whites in 96, about 7 percentage points. That seems to have possibly gone down a bit to 2 percentage points in 2004. There aren't big racial ethnic disparities among those in any debt in the likelihood of being in that top 20%. Now there are racial ethnic differences in being in debt at all. So I don't mean to mislead you into thinking, hey, it's all fine. Among those in debt, and Jason Hull has a very nice paper in Sociology of Education about this a couple years back. Among those in debt, the difference in the amounts of debt is what he shows in his paper. In our paper, we're talking about it being that top 20%, but the amounts of debt aren't that different by race ethnicity. What's different is the risk of being in any debt at all. I should have pointed out before, I'm sorry, all of these are models that control on some other stuff. So school type, race, ethnicity, gender, parent education, and income are all in there. And importantly, months enrolled, whether the respondent earned a bachelor's degree are in there as well. Because as I'll tell you in a few minutes, I'm most worried about the ones that don't earn that BA. I'm less worried about the ones that do.
Why was white a minute?
So that's a statistical thing. They're the comparison group. So blacks are 7% more likely than whites in 1996 to be in the top 20% of debt. They're in the law. And then looking at parent education, which is a fairly good measure of social background, but also parent income, there's really no relationship between the probability of being in that top 20% of debt, conditional on these other things. Right now, on the one hand, that might seem very equalizing. On the other hand, it might be worrisome because you might want to think that we would do a better job of preventing children of less educated or less affluent families of getting into that level of debt, right? So that can kind of break either way. But there's no statistically reliable relationship in either period between social background as measured by parent education or family income and the likelihood of being in that top 20% of the debt distribution. So part one of this story, a few takeaways. One, the distribution of education debt didn't change that much between 96 and 2004. So the way I think about this is, if there is a crisis for those graduated in 2001 and 2009, it's not a new crisis. It's a crisis that was there at the beginning of that time. The change that we observed between these periods was really dominated by those with very high levels of debt, the top 20%. So the median student, even the student with the 7th decile, didn't change that much in terms of their debt. Institutional choice plays an important role here. And I don't use choice lightly. I understand people experience constraints. I understand not everybody perceives them or has the same opportunities. At the end of the day, if students went to a public in-state or public flagship institution, then they were at markedly less risk of these levels of debt than if they went to a moderately competitive private not-for-profit institution or a for-profit institution in the later period. And then finally, socioeconomic and racial ethnic differences and the risk of high levels of debt were pretty small during this period. So there wasn't a lot of what I would call social stratification, differences by social background, in the levels of debt among people in debt during this period, right? That's undergraduate debt. Part two of our story. Who defaults on student loans? This is another thing you hear a lot about. People worry about rising default rates. There's better and better research out there looking at default because historically the U.S. Department of Education has only looked a few years out from repayment, the beginning of repayment. And so if you only look 3 years out from the beginning of repayment, it turns out default rates are rather small compared to if you look 20 years out. Not very surprising. If you're at risk of default every year, it adds up, right? So, why do we care? We care because it's really hard to discharge educational debt. You can't claim bankruptcy and get out of educational debt. You can't charge off on your credit card. You can't charge off on your educational debt the way you can on your credit card. It's also very difficult to restructure. There have been moments when the federal government has allowed some restructuring. We're not in one of those. So that's why we care. It's an increasing number of people, and it's very difficult to get rid of educational debt once you have it. You've got to pay it off. So I'm going to talk to you about what default means, how it's related to levels of student debt, who's at greater risk of default, and then finally, is default forever or just for now, which I didn't know about until I took this talk on. So, that's the caveat. I've done some really work on this. I'm totally ripping off my excellent colleagues. Sue Donarski. That's not the best picture. I grabbed it offline. I maybe should come for another frame. She's done a ton of work on this. She's awesome. She's been here. I think she was here last year for RFP. Okay. So first, definition. What is default? Default is a lapse in payment of 270 days during the period of repayment. That's a mouthful. So it means you've gone 270 days without paying, and that you were supposed to pay. It excludes periods of deferment, which means you're not accruing interest, or forbearance, which means you're accruing interest but you don't have to pay. So if you didn't have prior approval to skip your payments and you skipped for 270 days, you were in default. Judah Scott Clayton, who's also done some excellent work on this, recently put this nice report out where she shows change over time in default rates. And so on the y-axis, you'll see the default rates. On the x-axis, you have year relative to first enrollment. And what you can see is the 2003-4 entrants, the top line, take off rather more steeply from the 95-96 entrants in their default rates. And here she's looking for the earlier entrants. She can actually see 20 years after their first year of enrollment. And she finds that about a quarter of them have defaulted 20 years out. That's a big number. It's going to be higher, she estimates, for the later entrants. She would put that at about 40%, although that's projected. What she can observe is out to, I think, their 12th or 13th year of enrollment, they're about 27 percentage points. 27% of them have defaulted. Okay? So that's a problem. What a lot of people don't appreciate is it's not big dollars that lead to default. Typically, it is not the students who owe lots of money that are going to default. It's the students who don't owe very much money because they experimented with some post-secondary education, it didn't work out, they got out of college and didn't have any skills to prove that they were there. They don't have the means to pay it back. It's small levels of debt. And it's interesting because we know this from some of the recent work Sarah Goldberg-Grab and others have done on these small crises that kick up in students' lives. Like you can't pay for your car, so if you had a $500 emergency loan, maybe you could get by. It's the same idea here. If you went to school and you didn't finish a degree, you're at much greater risk of defaulting, right? And that's what's picked up by this dollar amount. So 34% of those owing up to $5,000, according to Donarsky's recent work, will default. 34% of those who entered repayment in 2009 will default within 5 years. You can compare that to 18% who owe more than $100,000. It's a big difference. The ones I'm most worried about are the ones with the least levels of debt. There are disparities by race ethnicity in default risk. And I think one of the important things for someone who's not me to really dig into is what drives these differences in risk. So here again, from Judah Scott Clayton's work, you can see the much steeper trajectory for black non-Hispanics in 95, 96, compared to whites down here, white non-Hispanic, in 95, 96. Everybody's moving up over time. African American students are moving up the most over time in their risk of default. That's a problem. That's something we should pay attention to. And that's something that I don't think we know, at least from my scan of the literature, enough about what's driving that. Another interesting thing that I learned along the way is that default is not forever for a lot of students. This is work that Jason Delisle and colleagues have done, showing over time what happens to those who default. So on the left side, 1 year after default, you can see that 11% of people are no longer in default. 2% are in default again after having exited default. The other 87% are still in default, right? Walk it up to 5 years after student default, almost 2/3 of the people who defaulted are undefaulted within that 5-year window. So just because somebody misses that payment for 270 days doesn't mean she or he is never going to pay it back or always be in default. People exit default status. What leads to that exit? I don't know. I would like to know more about it. What are the determinants of time in default? These are important questions. But the take home here is that just because people default doesn't mean they will default forever. Many of them will come back and repay their educational debts. Now, the point Sudanarski makes, and I totally agree with, is that it's not so much that we have a broken system of giving students money, it's that we have a broken system of letting them pay it back, right? Figuring out how to accommodate people so that they can pay it back on different terms, renegotiate, repackage the debt, whatever it is. I remember when I had student debt, we had a loan consolidation thing we could do. I benefited from that. The other thing is that you get locked in at an interest rate, so you can't refinance it, right? So that'd be another thing to think about. There are lots of things in this space to think about doing. But most people, even given these constraints and given arguably not great policies for debt repayment, manage to repay their debts, even if they default. Okay. So part 2, takeaways. Size matters, but it doesn't matter the way people think. It's not the people who owe the most money who are at greatest risk of default, it's the people who owe the least. Default rates do vary across types of institutions. I didn't show you that. For-profit institutions, as you might expect, team leaders and default rates. They differ across types of institutions and by race, and they do so in regressive ways, by which I mean it is students who historically have been less advantaged and institutions that historically attract less advantaged students that seem to have the highest default rates. That's worth knowing and understanding more about. And then finally, people who default typically, though not always, don't do so permanently. That's all I've got to share with you about default. No one's thrown anything yet. So far, so good. We'll see how this goes. Okay, so now how the other half borrows. Let's talk a little bit about graduate and professional debt, and this is where I think there's a lot more action. This is where I think there's potentially more grounds for concern. And this again is from work that I published with James Pine. In contrast to the relatively shallow change in the percentage of people who owe nothing for undergraduates, that was that left-hand bar at $0, there's quite a sharp change here over time. And here I'm taking you out to 2016 from 1996. But a lot of the action is 96 to 2004. So whereas in 96, about 43% of those who went to a graduate or professional program had no debt on the other side. That was 30% in 2004, about 23% in 2016. There's a big shift toward taking on debt to support graduate and professional education over time. You'll also notice these teal bars on the right-hand side of each distribution are uniformly, in the higher ends, higher. That is, we're squeezing more people into the higher levels of graduate debt here, okay? So at every level above $50,000, there's an increase over these cohorts in the percentage of people in those bins.
Have these been adjusted for?
These are real dollars. These are real dollars. Yeah. Adjusted for cost of living. Thank you. So this is that same funky figure I showed you for undergrads, except now we're talking about graduate students. We have an additional year here. And so, again, deciles of debt are on the bottom here. Here we have the amount of debt, the average level of debt within each decile, and those are charted by these dashed lines. And then here's the ratio. So with undergraduate debt, I showed you the ratios were fairly flat, a little lumpy, but around 7% or so below the 8th decile. That is not the case with graduate and professional debt. Graduate and professional debt, you're between 1.5 and 1.75. That is 50 to 75% higher in 2004 than you were in 1996. And if you walk out to 2016, you're between 75% and 225%. Graduate and professional debt has gone up a lot. It's gone up a lot across the board. So graduate and professional debt is a bigger chunk of what's happening in the 1.6 trillion now than it was before. And people are generally in not the same boat, but a similar boat in terms of having to borrow more. Right? It's not the case that, for undergrads, it was up about 10% over the first period. Here it was 75, 50% over the first period. Okay, here's the distribution of that debt by degree over time. And what you can see is that master's degrees are taking a bigger share of that debt distribution over time. They go from 48% of all graduate and professional debt in 1996 to 64% in 2016. And we have a story for this in the paper. I won't get into it here too much, but we suggest that students are facing a perfect storm in the financial aid realm, whereby the state, the federal government, and states in general don't do nearly as much to subsidize graduate and professional education as they do to subsidize undergraduate education. And it's of less public concern. This means that, and you know, we know this, those of us who work here know this, while the legislature may hold the line on undergraduate tuition, they may be more likely to look the other way on graduate and professional tuition. And so graduate and professional programs have evolved such that they cost more now. They don't typically have more aid than they used to. And that's contributing to these. Also, when James and I did this work, we thought there might be some creep of graduate programs. You certainly sort of get that sense talking to colleagues in the business of higher ed. We couldn't find evidence for it, but recently there have been a few more papers that suggest, yes, in fact, we've started to develop more master's programs, do more marketing of master's programs. So that may be part of this. But again, this is another area I would love to see some people do some work in. I don't think we know nearly enough about it. But master's degrees, as a share of that debt, have increased over time. If you think about who's at risk of entering into any debt for graduate and professional education, this might not shock you. Doctors and lawyers typically have a greater risk of entering debt than people in these other master's degrees programs. That would be like a master's in sociology. MSW's in there. The only master's degrees we took out were the business, STEM degrees, including health, and a master's in education. So over time, it looks like the MDs and JDs are driving part of this risk into debt. And again, that's not surprising. Those are training programs that are very expensive. Those are also occupations that are fairly lucrative. What does institution type look like here? For-profits kind of bounce around, and partly it's because we don't have a ton of data on them in '96, so I wouldn't take this too seriously. But private for-profits may make some contribution relative to public, so 9 percentage points more likely to be in debt in 2016 if you're at a private for-profit than you're in a public sector. But in general, there's not a tremendous amount of institutional activity on this side of it. This is part of the story that I find concerning. Race, ethnicity. Over time, you find the risk of entering into debt for African Americans has been higher than whites at all times and perhaps increased from 9 percentage points to 12 percentage points. And again, this is the risk of entering into debt. And those who are Latinx, from a non-significant 3 percentage points up to 6 percentage points. And then women also are at greater risk of entering debt now than they used to be relative to men. So women are 7 percentage points more likely than men in 2016 to enter into debt. Okay? This is all entering into debt, right? So this is part one of this, or part A. I'm using part one also. The big thing you might want to know is, well, how much do they owe? Conditional on owing something. So, this is the factorial difference in how much people owe. In this case, relative to others' master's degrees. So starting with 1996, MD health professionals owed 3.85 times what those who were in other master's degrees owed on finishing their education in 1996. 3.85 times. That goes down, actually, to about 3.25 times as much as the amount typically owed by other masters. Okay? So there's perhaps a decline in the amount more that health professionals owe, but in general, it's about 3.25 times what other masters degree folks hold. It's like a master's in social work, master's in sociology, a master's in ed policy would count. Yeah, a big box of masters that do not include MBAs, STEM degrees in education. So over time, these folks owe the most money. Over time, interestingly, the MBAs and the masters in education owe slightly less, although that advantage is declining. Okay, so MDs and law professionals, not surprisingly, are driving a lot of this higher end debt over time, although perhaps less so. Here, there are sectoral differences that are worth noting. In particular, by the time we get out to 2016, if you went to a private nonprofit, you owe 18% more than if you went to a public institution for your graduate or professional degree, all else equal. If you went to a private for-profit, you owe 79% more than if you went to a public institution for your graduate or professional degree, all else equal. So over time, there is a fanning out across institutions of the expected levels of debt among those owing anything. And again, a cause for concern, one of the larger changes we see is for African American degree recipients relative to white degree recipients, where they owed a non-significant 21% more in 1996. By the time we were out to 2016, on average, African American students will owe 54% more for their graduate or professional degrees. And again, this is conditioning on the type of institution you attended, conditioning on the degree you earned. 54% more. Also over time, women seem to be accruing more debt, where they were not significantly different from men in the amount of money they owed if they owed money. In 96 and 2016, on average, they owed 24% more than otherwise comparable men. These are big differences. These are differences we should pay attention to. Now you might ask if it's worth it. I'm not entirely sure on average if it is. I'm not entirely sure it's not, quite honestly. If you look over time, here I'm just giving you the median earnings for different degree levels. Sorry, I'm giving this to you in just 2016. Different degree levels and race ethnicity. So let's take African Americans and whites as an example. At every point in that time, whites with the same degree are more than African Americans with the same degree, and that's not surprising, we know this. The percentage gain for African Americans for an additional credential is actually slightly larger than the percentage gain for whites getting an additional credential. Partly that's because the base is lower, but partly it's because if you do the math on these, the incremental bump in median salary for an additional credential is not very dissimilar across racial ethnic groups, right? So you combine that fairly uniform bump with a lower base, you get a higher percentage point return. Doesn't mean it's okay, but that's where we are. So is it worth it? I don't know. Another thing to think about, and this is a little outside, but another maybe underappreciated fact about the wage structure in the United States. People talk a lot about the rising college premium. The college premium hasn't risen all that much in about 20 years. It's rising a little bit, but what's driven the college premium is graduate and professional education. And so at the top here, right, and this is from work by Robert Valletta at the Federal Reserve. At the top here you see the graduate degree in the blue dash line. And then at the bottom, the red dash line is the college-only degree, which you see was up until 1990, then up at a much more gradual rate of change. Whereas the graduate degree continues to pull away from the college degree over time. So is it worth it? Well, if you want to secure that college advantage in earnings, perhaps it is, because that college advantage in earnings is increasingly an advantage enjoyed by those with a graduate or professional degree.
What does college or more mean? Is he done somewhere towards it?
That's what we usually look at. So college or more is what people will usually look at in a report. They'll say, well, if you're in college or more, what's the college premium? And the whole point of this is to take that apart and say college only and graduate degree. And it turns out that that college or more rise is being propped up by the graduate degree increase, not the college increase. They're not going up at the same rates. So, part 3 takeaways. There's been tremendous growth in graduate student and professional student debt over the past 2 decades. There's been growth in the share of students incurring any debt. There's been growth in the levels of debt that they incur. And there's been growth in the share of the overall debt portfolio, that $1.6 trillion that they hold. African American students have higher debt burdens than white students, conditional on the stuff we have in our model, and conditional on having debt. And that disadvantage appears to be getting worse. The returns to graduate and professional education are propping up the returns to college or more. right? And again, it doesn't mean that students who go to college aren't earning more than those who don't. They are. It's just the rate of increase has really trailed off, and graduate and professional education is carrying that. So it's not clear whether or not the debt incurred is worth the price. I suspect it usually is, but that's an I suspect with all the humility that some flimsy phrase like that should happen. So a few caveats to all this. One, as I mentioned, I'd love to see someone other than me extend the series for undergraduate debt to more recent data. It could be that things have changed a bit more in the past cohort, and I just don't pick it up. Another one that I'm worried about is that I haven't said anything about plus loans, parents taking out educational debt for their kids. Those account for about a quarter of the federal loan portfolio. They've actually increased in the share that they've accounted for over time. It's a quarter now. I do worry about that, and I don't know that we have great data on plus loans. They're not held in the same place. And sidebar, it turns out that NSLDS, the National Student Loan Data System at the U.S. Department of Education, not that eager to share data with a lot of us. So it's kind of hard, even for people in the U.S. Department of Education with whom I've spoken, to get them to share data. So it's a hard place to do work. So, to wrap up, things that don't worry me a lot, the size of the debt burden overall, I'm not that worried about that. I'm worried about whether it pays off, but I'm not worried about the size per se. I'm not terribly worried about the debt levels for those who are securing professional degrees. I'm not that worried about undergraduate debt in general, though I do think that if we want to reduce undergraduate debt, maybe doubling down on encouraging students to consider those in-state institutions might be a good play. I am worried about the burden of typically small amounts of debt for those who fail to complete a credential, and possibly for those who complete a sub-baccalaureate credential at great cost. So for profits where you could get like a credential in some health profession or HVAC or something like that, I worry about that. I worry about the increase in the share of debt associated with master's degrees. I'm much less confident that these degrees have large labor market payoffs, and they're probably much more heterogeneous, but again, this is something that somebody should do some empirical work on. And I'm worried about racial and perhaps gender inequalities in graduate student debt. Even if the relative returns for graduate and professional education are greater for African American students, it's sort of hard to imagine how we would justify a system like that. And we don't know enough about what's underlying those differences to really have a handle on what's going on there. So, thank you for listening. Also, big thanks to James Klein, who took the lead on this work and did a lot of it. And to Nick Hinman for his constructive and always helpful feedback on this. I'm happy to take any questions you have.